welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today I'll be joined once again by Christopher. How are you doing, Christopher?
Good. How about you, Connor?
I'm not too bad. Today we'll be discussing the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which passed its first reading in the House of Commons on Wednesday. The bill would essentially make protest near impossible and has drawn outcry from every party except the Conservative Party, and it passed on a purely party line base in the House of Commons for its first reading. Any additional thoughts, Christopher?
Well, yeah. So when it comes to the Conservative Party, it's interesting to see them introduce a bill of this kind because, I don't know, I always had this thought that the Conservative Party would at least stand by some partly libertarian positions. You know, this bill is really, in my opinion, an overt attack on the democratic process of being able to protest. And it puts far too much authority into the hands of the police and the government.
Well, yeah, this is in reaction to the Sarah Edouard's vigil the other week, where the police used excessive force and violence and even used force on people who were actually kneeling in mourning of Sarah Edouard's death. And it's the government's response to police brutality is to give the police more power to stop assembled gatherings in the public. It also expands protests to single person protests. These are essentially like you go into the town or something and some guy's shouting about on a microphone, but the government's doing whatever single person protest, and people like that could actually face a £2,500 fine under this bill.
This is just purely from example from my behalf. I go into the town and I hear people preaching persistently about biblical teachings. And it annoys me, sure, but do I want them people to be criminalized for doing this? No, I don't, because I think it is fundamentally part of somebody's human rights to exercise and express their emotions and their opinions. And I think by introducing this bill, that is really cutting down on that. And the bill actually, this is what it actually states, and I quote, serious public disorder, it allows the police to basically restrict serious public disorder, serious damage to property, or serious disruption to the life of the community. Which
sounds fair when it's read like that, but it's the fact that it gives the interpretation of those rules to the police and to the Home Secretary.
Yeah, and that's one of the many criticisms people have about this bill. I mean, they're too broad. The bill and its functions are too broadly defined. They aren't really written in too much detail, and I think that the government really need to amend this bill to really iron out some of them problems and to completely, in my opinion, subtract the newfound authority that has been given to the police.
Well, I think that was a lot of the Conservatives who voted for it the other day. They kind of signalled in the debate that they anticipated that it would be amended in the committee stage. But of course, that's not something you can guarantee, especially when the Conservatives still have an overwhelming control over the Commons at the moment. And it will be very interesting to see if there are any changes that do come during committee to see the final bill when it is voting on for a third time.
Yeah, and I think the main line that was being reiterated throughout the entirety of the bill debate from members on especially the Labour side of the aisle was that protests aren't supposed to be convenient. They aren't supposed to be convenient for the government. Protests are supposed to be inconvenient to a degree to make a point.
Yeah, that is the whole idea of a protest. Like this bill, it will attempt to stop people from being a public nuisance by protesting. But that is the entire point of protests. David Lammy, the Shadow Justice Secretary, made a very good speech on Wednesday, and he made the point that the Conservatives are saying that it is okay to protest as long as you're not too quiet or you're not too much of an inconvenience. So essentially, you can protest as long as you're not doing anything a protest should do.
We see now that the chief police officer can now impose a start and finish time upon the protest, set noise limits, and apply these rules to a demonstration by just one person, as you were saying earlier. So it could literally be a man or a woman in the town, protesting with a placard and making some noise, and that is not considered to be a criminal offence.
Yes, and I think another part of this bill that has drawn outcry is that it would raise the sentence for vandalising or damaging a statue or a memorial it would make that sentence 10 years, which is higher than the average sentencing for rape, which is 9 years and 9 months.
Yeah, and the result of disobeying the noise rule is a maximum fine of £2,500, which is it is crazy in my opinion.
Yeah. Is there any thoughts on the statute sentencing?
Just last week, I believe, I can't actually put a name to what the statue was. A group of people tore down a statue of an old slave owner, which is understandable because you don't want old slave owners being memorized in that way. You know, a statue is something that glorifies them.
Edward Colston's in Bristol.
Yeah, and so it's evident that the government care more about statues in this bill than they do about actual serious crimes being committed to me.
Yeah, well, that moves on to the other side of the bill, the part that the Conservative Party are trying to justify the bill. And what one of them is, it moves a license for predatory offences like harassment and sexual assault. It moves the ability for the offender to be put on license from half of a term to 66% of a term. So essentially, they would not be able to be released early until they've filled at least 2/3 of their term rather than half their term, which it was previously. But I think that's just kind of trying to camouflage the protesting part, and really that is really what the government is pointing to, is just this part of the bill.
Whenever I was watching the bill debate the other day, you could really see the Conservative Party twisting the functions of this bill to try and completely dodge the questions and the criticism that have been applied to this bill in regards to protesting.
Another part of the bill that they're pointing to is that it doubles time served to 2 years for assaulting emergency service workers, which again is a good idea, but it's the fact that they've linked it to the protesting part of the bill, and it's kind of just a simple political tactic so that they can point at Labour and SNP and Plaid Cymru in the next general election and say they voted against raising the time served for assaulting emergency service workers.
Yeah, try and pin that against Labour in the next general election. They voted against protecting our public service workers. They voted against protecting our policemen, when that just is not the case. Labour, in my opinion, have done a very good job at pointing out the flaws within this bill. At first, they were going to abstain from voicing opposition to the bill and from voting on the bill, but I'm glad that they swiftly came to the realisation that this is just too big to ignore.
The bill passed quite easily on its first reading, 359 in favour to 263 noes. The Conservatives were the only party to vote in favour, and pretty much every other party voted no. That would be the Alliance and Social SDLP here in Northern Ireland. The Green Party and their one MP voted no. The SNP voted no. Plaid Cymru voted no. The Liberal Democrats, all 4 independents, and the Labour Party all voted no. But of course, not enough to overturn the Conservatives' majority. And it does make you worry about what else the Conservatives could do with such a mandate in the Commons.
It definitely does. I mean, I was surprised that this bill had even been, suggested by the Conservatives. It is especially bad this week, considering a young girl was killed by an off-duty police officer, and the government's response has basically been, well, this young girl is being killed by the off-duty police officer, so what we'll do is we'll introduce a new bill that basically gives the police more authority, which doesn't make sense in my opinion.
No, it's completely counterproductive. But especially this comes the year after, of course, the international Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd by Darragh Chauvin in the United States. And it kind of just seems like a bit out of touch for the Conservatives to do this, especially given the similarities between the Sarah Everard vigil and the Black Lives Matter movement, and police use excessive force to remove peaceful protesters who were mourning and promoting change to the system.
It does show that the Conservative Party really have no interest in serving these people who want change and desperately need change to the system. I just want to divert attention to the Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy, and his speech in regards to the legislation, or bill. He stated that it was a mess and that it was poorly thought out, that there were poorly thought out measures to impose disproportionate controls on free expression and the right to protest, which I would totally agree with.
Yeah, and he also talked about the statute part of the bill in his speech talking about the fact that 10 years for damaging a statue, but which is completely disproportionate to the charges for rape. And he gave the example of a man who raped a 7-year-old disabled girl and got less than 10 years. It is quite disgusting that something like that can happen.
It's completely horrific, and it is disgusting in every single way. And the fact that the Conservative government at this point want to, pay more attention to statues being pulled down over that is just, it's horrible. And I don't even know how to describe the disgust. The Prime Minister didn't obviously voice opposition to this bill. He thought the bill was brilliant. He thought that it would toughen up sentences for rapists, stopping the early release of sexual and violent offenders. And then he proceeded to call on MPs to back the bill, believing it was a sensible package of measures.
For him to say that, you would have to ignore at least 75% of the bill, which deals with the protesting situation in the UK. It's worth noting that this would only apply to England and Wales, but I think that's still completely unacceptable for the people of those two countries.
Yeah, I mean, that is also the vast population of the UK. So, 53 million people living in England have to now live under these restrictions, which are, as I said, an overt attack on the function of democracy and its principles.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It is very difficult, especially if read people in the media trying to stay balanced on this. But it's very, very difficult to stay balanced on a bill such as this. And the Conservatives have said that this was in their 2019 manifesto, but only part of it was, and that is, of course, the tougher sentences for sexual and violent crimes. But nothing in their manifesto was about the protesting side of this.
They've used their manifesto as a vessel to manipulate this bill into something that it wasn't. To manipulate people into believing that this bill does something that is good, but people and trying to cover up the bad side of the bill, which is the protesting part, that is really quite bad. So you were to separate, for example, the protesting part from the bill, and that were to be burned in a fire, and the bill was as it was in terms of prison sentences, and apart from the statute part, because I find that rather unnecessary, then the bill really wouldn't have received as much opposition as what it's currently receiving. But the fact that they had to also include protests, which they have not been a problem over the past year, and just to look at one of the police chief and what he's had to say about this, he is the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and he is a Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and he was frustrated that he could not prevent the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations from the climate during 2019, which in my opinion is just a complete example of why this bill is wrong.
Yep, completely agree with that. I'm going to move on to now the possibility of this bill becoming law. So, of course, it passed the first reading in the Commons, and there was one notable Conservative who spoke out against the bill, which is, of course, Theresa May. She had issues with the protesting part, but it nevertheless voted in favour. Of course, it doesn't mean it passed. It means it only goes on to a second reading now, and then potentially a third, and then passage to the House of Lords. Do you think, Christopher, that this will become law?
I can't see, as you were saying, Connor, the House of Lords definitely possibly amending this bill and sending it back to the Commons.
Yeah.
I do think that is
the protesting part?
Yeah, I do think that is a very likely possibility, but I'm unsure at this time of what exactly the Lords will do. They may allow the bill to proceed if it does receive a large enough vote in the Commons, but currently, as it stands, the bill will continue to pass through the Commons. The Lords is a completely different story. Just to touch on what you were saying about Theresa May, I think that within the party itself, I think that if they were given the opportunity by the party whip, they probably would have voted a different way. But I'm sure that they're probably just wanting to comply with the party on this issue.
Yeah, well, I think it will be much more interesting to see the final bill in the Commons after all the amendments and whatnot, and see what happens, and then see which Conservatives vote against it. But I think the recent history, of course, there was the Internal Market Bill last year, which was a Conservative bill that broke international law. And what could happen with this bill is similar to what happened with that one, is that it passed the House of Commons and then the Lords removed the part of the bill that broke international law and then sent it back for passage. And so you could see something like that happen again this year.
Yeah, I mean, now the government has this power to prevent protests from happening. They're going to really, really need to ensure that police don't go out of their way to use this power unwisely, which they will. And this will, in turn, really, I don't know how to put this any other way, it will bite the government in the ass.
I certainly hope so. Because if this is what you're getting in a conservative government, this kind of legislation, then I certainly hope that people won't stand for it, because freedom of speech and freedom to assemble, perhaps the two most important aspects of any healthy democracy, and any attempt to circumvent them must be completely stopped in its track.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that currently, over the past couple of years, the Conservative government has really set a bad example to the public. I don't think that whenever he was talking about the internal market bill and this, he doesn't realise how much damage this really does to the social fabric of the country.
Yes, completely. It's damaging. It's damaging to the reputation of the United Kingdom internationally. I mean, like for example, the UK, part of the Iran nuclear deal. How were they able to do that when Iran could just turn around and say that you're violating like the rights of why would we negotiate with you when you're doing the same thing that you're accusing us of? But yeah, it is quite bad, and it's a very interesting unfolding and developing situation, and I'm quite anxious to see the results of it.
Yep, totally agree. It is going to be very interesting, and I just hope that the Lords do understand the wrongs of this bill and they strike it down or amend it.
Yeah, I think what's much more likely is they'll amend it and then send it back. Any closing thoughts, Christopher?
No closing thoughts. I'd just like to say that what happened over the weekend and the previous week has been horrific and really saddening, and I do send my deepest condolences to Sir Everard's family.
Yes, I think everyone in the UK is doing the same. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.